So when Billie Eilish first burst onto the scene, I wasn't really particularly all that interested in her sound or her aesthetic. Didn't really do much for my ears. I heard that Khalid collaboration that they did last year. Honestly, really poor for me. Like, if I'd have done a worst songs of the year list, which I never really bother doing, that perhaps could have made it somewhere on the list. I found that song ridiculously and relentlessly boring. Now, at that point, I was never really sure if she was ever going to be for me personally. But in regards to Khalid, I think he's an interesting reference point because although they have very different sounds and styles with their own music, there's something about how I feel with the Billie Eilish's debut album as I did with his debut album too. Now again, there's not really much to compare in terms of the music or the quality of the styles that they were both going for, but there was something I came away from Khalid's album that kind of wasn't really clicking with me, and that was his youthfulness and his immature naivety at times. Now that's to absolutely be expected, and you can't really knock an artist for that really when they're making their music when they're like 19, because the album did come out when he was about 19-20 years old, and Billie Eilish is even younger than that for her debut album. But there are just times where some lyrics and motifs and ideas just don't quite hit me in the ways I want them to, because I feel as though Billie just isn't quite there yet. When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go is not only a title that kind of just proved my previous point, but is also an album filled with a few songs that I think could be fleshed out to greater outcomes when she gets a little bit older. Wish You Were Gay has already been quite a controversial track, and while I do see where she's coming from with the lyrics here, it definitely could have been framed a little bit better. It just sounds far too much like something I would hear a 15 or 16-year-old girl say. Oh, you broke my heart. I would have rather to heard you have said you were gay than to have done me this wrong. I'm not going to say it's the most offensive thing that she could possibly say, but I can certainly see why people would take issue with this. But it's not like she's putting anyone down for being who they are. It's just essentially her youthfulness speaking out here, saying that, you know, it would have done me better to have heard you say you were gay than to have cheated on me or broke my heart. And for me personally, you know, I feel as though I probably would have heard a conversation like this like 7 years ago in McDonald's with a group of teenage girls sat across from me talking about their relationships and stuff. So it definitely just reeks a little bit of teenage, you know, conversations that just really don't age particularly well, because in 7 or 8 years she's not going to be thinking this way. Other issues that I have within the lyrical department on this album are tracks like All the Good Girls Go to Hell, which does come across as a little edgy at times, which might not be the best word to use, but I do feel like there's that kind of like edge to this album that Billie is attempting to aim for but doesn't always quite get there. And on a track like Bad Guy, I think it's a similar issue too. Now the thing is though, is that the tracks I've talked about so far actually sound really good. Like, they're really well produced, and my minor issues with the way she's framing her lyrics and how there's kind of this like bad girl aesthetic going on throughout the album can kind of be diminished by how good these songs sound. Certainly there are tracks on this album that completely waver out, and there's barely anything going on musically whatsoever that I find myself struggling to concentrate. But a track like Bad Guy completely flips that upside down, where her vocals are so muffled and like quiet and whispery, and yet the beat is actually got quite a good melody to it, and it's hard hitting at points. Really surprises me how these two styles come together at times, like especially on a track like this or Bury a Friend, where like her vocals are so like nondescript or so quiet, where you can't really make out much of what she's saying or get much of a melody out of her voice, but yet it still matches the instrumental really well. It baffles me how it works. I'm not complaining about it either, because I'd actually really like to see her do more of this in the future, and would have liked more of this on the album, to be honest. Saying that though, the slower track When the Party's Over actually works really well as a ballad. Like, I like the lyrics on the chorus here, where she's saying that, you know, she's coming home and she's alone, and she could lie and say that she likes it like that. in the sense that, you know, some people do pretend that they like their own company, they like to be alone and stuff like that, but in reality they're just saying it and putting on a front, and they would much rather to not be alone. I think she puts forward that idea really well on this track, and to say I was kind of knocking her lyrics earlier on, I can't really knock them here because that would be really harsh, and it's actually a really well written song. It's a real shame that this goes into track 8 though, which is also titled 8, and I do not know what she's going for with the vocals on this one. This is like attempting to appeal to the American Horror Story crowd, and that's not even to knock the show American Horror Story either, but there's just something about the way she's trying to do this voice. It's attempting to have this aesthetic to it, and it just sounds horrific. I appreciate she's trying to do something different, but it did not work here, I've got to say. Area Friend is quite strange and odd and quirky and off the wall. Has this like tribal drumming beat to it that actually really works well. Honestly, I think this is really the experimental side to it that's actually going over quite well, because the tune at the core of the song, it works really well and it sounds great. So, you know, I have a lot of issues with this album, as I've mentioned already, but overall, generally, it's actually pretty solid. Like, for a debut album from a young artist, this is alright, and you can't expect every youthful teenager to be coming out with albums on the level of, like, I don't know, A Pure Heroine by Lorde, or Illmatic by Nas, or even Tidal by Fiona Apple, which isn't her best album, but it's still a very good album to start off with from a young age. And plenty of other artists too that nailed it on their first album that I could list on and on and on, but they don't come around very often, and I think it's important to recognise that Billie Eilish here has a lot in her that could eventually put out those great albums in the future. Definitely like to see where she takes the style and approach that she's going for in this album, because this isn't really typical for the mainstream, and I'm quite surprised that something like this has become so huge, you know? I think she ends off the album really well with the ballad I Love You, and she's actually got quite a good knack of writing these ballads, so yeah, I think overall this is good. It's not quite great, it's not quite a really good album, to be honest. It perhaps could end up getting overrated, because I have seen people call this like an amazing debut album. I wouldn't really ever go as far as saying that, but I will say it's a 6 out of 10, and this is definitely worth your time. I think it's worth checking out. Yeah, let me know your thoughts if you have listened to it. If you like it more than me or you like it less than me, it'd be great to hear what you think. Thank you for watching my review. Have a good day. Subscribe if you haven't already. Goodbye. Bye.